Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I am Matthew Silverman, the director of the Haberman Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our program titled Steeltown Jews, the History and Legacy of Homestead, Pennsylvania, with Tammy Hepps. Over the past couple of years, we have explored different pockets of Jewish life throughout the United States. For those of you who missed our previous American Jewish Life lectures, I invite you to watch the recordings posted on our website, such as Jewish Life in the South, in Texas, and most recently, we explored Midwestern Jewish life through the lens of Madison, Wisconsin. Tonight, we move a bit east and uncover some of the significant narratives in the history and experiences in Western Pennsylvania. I welcome all of you joining us from Pittsburgh and the surrounding areas. I also saw registrations from as far away as Alaska, Canada, and across the United States. So thank you all for joining us. One of my hopes for this evening or afternoon for some of you is that we'll hear stories and experiences that can possibly connect us to our own family and communal narratives. On a logistical note, please use the Q&A button to ask questions. Questions will be discussed at the end of the lecture. And now to introduce our speaker, Tammy Hepps is a historian of the Jewish experience in Western Pennsylvania. She combines in-depth historical research with techniques from technology and genealogy to reconstruct overlooked stories from the past in an engaging way. She has presented her findings around the world, including at the Library of Congress and at the International Jewish Genealogy Conference in Jerusalem. Her best-known research is into the history of the Jewish community in the former steelmaking center of Homestead, Pennsylvania, as we will explore this evening. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Tammy. The screen is now yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and be able to speak to this wonderful audience. So I'd like to start by reflecting on an experience I had earlier this month. I was one of about 10 different speakers at a conference put on by the National Endowment of the Humanities in conjunction with some local organizations here in Pittsburgh, bringing together history teachers from around the country to learn about the Homestead Steel Strike and how they can teach it to their students. And so I was one of the last lecturers of the week, and I had the privilege of hearing the folks who came before me. And in all of their lectures, they touched upon the things that you commonly think of when you think about Homestead history: Carnegie and Frick and labor and industry and union and capital, steel, technology, government, all of those big themes. And the whole time I had a really funny feeling of, well, where is my homestead? Where is this place that I'm supposed to be something of an expert in that I've spent years researching? And so the truth is that I didn't come to study Homestead for any of those big themes that any of those other historians from that conference study. I wanted to know how people lived in Homestead. And the reason why is that 4 generations of my family lived there. And so yes, I did read about Homestead in my high school history textbook, but I wanted to understand what it really meant to be from this famous place. There are a lot of former industrial towns in Western Pennsylvania that once had thriving Jewish communities. And to be honest, I would have attempted to study whichever one my family was from, famous or not. It just so happens that the one that my family is from is the one that people from all over the world have been studying for more than 125 years. What is it that people are studying when they say that they're studying Homestead? It's easy to say things like the evolving relationship between labor and management. But my theory after all these years is that people are really asking, what does it take to thrive in America? And then a bunch of corollary questions to that, like what is the cost? Who wins? Who loses? Is it worth it? Can we do better? What would it take to do better? And so what I see in Homestead when I try to answer these questions may be quite different from what other scholars see in Homestead when they ask the same questions. But Homestead is still my starting point for these questions, just as it has been for so many before me. And the story of Homestead begins in 1871, when lots of former farmland went up for auction to create a town where previously there had been none. In the late 1870s, a local steel company picked up land just east of the new town. In the spring of 1880, their mill started to go up, and Homestead's first steel was produced on March 19th, 1881. What happened next in Homestead and its steel mill sets the stage for the famous battle in 1892. From the beginning, Homestead's mill was the most modern steel mill in the country. It was founded by former Carnegie associates turned rivals, but business challenges proved intractable for them, however, and in October of 1883, they asked Carnegie to buy them out. A little bit embarrassing. And after that, Carnegie spent the 1880s further upgrading the mill, and the Homestead Works was world famous by 1890 for its technology. One of those intractable business challenges was the union that represented some of the mill's workmen. There were two violent strikes even before Carnegie took over. In 1889, Carnegie and the Homestead Union went head-to-head, and Carnegie lost. Heading into the 1890s, the Homestead Works was one of the few remaining unionized steel mills. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, there was a unique partnership between the town and its unions. A major factor in the union's earlier victories was their ability to organize the entire town in order to prevent the steel company from bringing in strikebreakers. During this time, there arrived a growing number of Eastern European laborers in Homestead, primarily from Hungary and Slovakia, who were brought in to undercut the wages and demands of native-born workers. They were not well received by the rest of Homestead. And so this is the well-known steel history of Homestead, but what I see in it are the seeds for Homestead's Jewish community. I see that the opening and expansion of the steel mill led to the growing population of the town, which led to a slew of secondary economic opportunities better suited to Jewish immigrants. I see that Jews in Eastern Europe learned about Homestead through the same channels of information that reached non-Jewish Eastern European laborers. Not just the general message that Homestead was a place of prosperity, but also for the specific opportunity to sell to customers whose language they shared and whose customs they understood. The first documented Jewish resident of Homestead moved his family to the town right before the steel mill started. And he opened a business well-suited to all of the hardy workers who were pouring into town, a saloon. His name was Abraham Skirball, and yes, his son Jack, born in 1895, is that Jack Skirball, the one whose name you see all over Jewish and medical buildings, especially in New York and LA. And so the Skirballs were probably the only Jewish family in Homestead for most of the decade. That said, I'm pretty sure that there were Jewish peddlers running around Homestead through the 1880s and probably in the previous decade as well. When the town was small and isolated, there were few stores, and peddlers could bring people goods that they couldn't otherwise procure locally. That's not to say that peddling was such a positive trade to ply. Peddlers in Homestead were treated poorly. They were teased, swindled, and sometimes attacked. One man, Meyer Grinberg, was, according to his son, quote, just a very small man. They used to call him all kinds of anti-Semitic remarks, and he just couldn't take it. There was a peddler ordinance in Homestead, as there was in many such places, which required them to pay a daily license fee. It was a protective measure put forth by the local merchants. And it cut into the already meager earnings of peddlers. A young peddler, Joseph Lastuski, was arrested further upriver for peddling without a license. He, quote, begged piteously with the police officer to make it up. In the late 1880s, the Skirballs were joined at Homestead by the Segelmans, who moved there from a quieter town upriver. Father Ralph was a skilled watchmaker. The Skirballs and Segelmans came from towns just 30 miles apart on either side of the Prussian-Lithuanian border. And in the late 1880s, they were joined by the first Hungarian Jews arriving in Homestead, including my great-grandfather. The Hungarian Jews established themselves in the immigrant neighborhood called the Ward, which stayed the center of the Jewish community for decades. They largely started out as peddlers and grocers who sold to people who came from the same places as they did. And so heading into the early 1890s, a number of Jews grew about 2.5 times before the strike, mostly Hungarians, but some Litvaks, and one terribly unhappy German family. Some peddled and some had shops. Notably, they did not work for the steel mill. In all my years of searching, I found one reference to one Jewish person who worked for the steel mill for just a short amount of time before the strike. The Jews who put down roots in Homestead came with skills or community connections that gave them other economic opportunities. And anyway, anti-Semitism in the mill largely cut off that employment possibility for them. That's not to say that the Jews of Homestead did not depend on the mill. Everyone in Homestead did. Money from the mills was how most families earned their income and how they could pay for the things that merchants sold. This was always the case for Homestead's Jewish merchants. When I look at the famous Battle of Homestead in 1892, then, my focus is on the town and all the townspeople who went through it together. While it began as a dispute between the steel mill and the union that represented just a fraction of the mill steelworkers, no homesteader emerged unscathed. As the 1889 contract between Carnegie and the union approached its expiration in June of 1892, Carnegie charged his deputy, Henry Clay Frick, with eradicating the union for once and for all. Frick surrounded the mill with military-like fortifications, some of which you can see in this picture, and attempted to bring the Pinkertons under cover of darkness to take over the mill compound to enable him to restart the mill with scabs. But at 2:30 a.m. on July 6, 1892, the Union got wind that the Pinkertons were arriving by barge, as you can see in this picture. The town was awoken by a warning signal. They leapt out of bed and charged towards the steelworks, Union and non-Union, Carnegie and non-Carnegie workers, Americans and foreigners, even women and children in shocking numbers. The Pinkertons tried to land, but shots rang out immediately. A battle raged for the next 12 hours. The Union won the day, but they lost the war because Frick got the governor of Pennsylvania to send in the state militia to put the whole town under martial law for the next 3 months. This famous photograph always shows up in talks about the strike. People see the soldiers in the foreground and their encampment behind them. But here's what I see. This building here is the Bose Building, which was the headquarters for the Union. Next door was the clothing store of Levi Myers. And next to that was the building where Abraham Skirball tried out a few different businesses. On this street perpendicular were the residences of the Hungarian Jewish community, my great-grandfather and all of his friends. And on the other side of the Bose Building, we have the clothing store of Isabel Grossman. Represented in this picture are probably more than 60 Jews who were in Homestead at this time. So here's another drawing of the Union headquarters, again with the arrow, one of many similar drawings that appeared in newspapers and magazines at that time. And so here's another look. The Bose Building, and here outside of Isidore Grossman's store is that Isidore Grossman outside shaking hands. As you will see in this talk, Jewish people scarcely figure in the history of Homestead. But I hope, as you will see time and again, the evidence is right there in the pictures everyone is looking at, if only they know what they're looking at. And so the Battle of Homestead wasn't about the Jews of Homestead, and I am not trying to suggest otherwise. Just before the battle, Homestead's weekly newspaper pronounced, "It is not the 4,000 workmen alone who are affected by the lockout, but the 10,000 inhabitants of Homestead." This quote is, for me, just as much of a touchstone as the previous pictures for the stories that I am trying to reclaim and the disconnected narratives that I am trying to reconnect. Frick managed to restart the mill by late summer with outside workers, but the steelworkers of Homestead refused to return to work until they were offered a fair contract. The town had to organize charitable efforts. Some local merchants protested they shouldn't have to give since they were already selling on credit to the striking men. Others did contribute. Now, to be fair, the temporary addition of 6,000 militiamen to Homestead's population did benefit many merchants for a time, as did the growing number of non-union steelworkers who moved into Homestead to restart the mill. But you can see even before the strike is over, the diverging destinies of these two employment groups. The union voted to give up the strike before Thanksgiving of 1892. Carnegie and Frick had won. They crushed the union and abolished it from the Homestead works. Only 500 of the 2,000 steelworkers who tried to return to their jobs after the strike were accepted. Many had to leave Homestead. This isn't just a talk about what happened in Homestead, though. It's about how people talk about what happened in Homestead, about how they only talk about some of what happened in Homestead. And the truth is that that narrowing of narratives happened very early. Even before the battle, the Homestead works were world famous. Outside of Western Pennsylvania, Homestead was metonymous with the mill. When the contract with the union ended at the end of July of 1892, the eyes of the world were upon Homestead, as their newspaper noted. Observers understood the significance of the Homestead mill and the significance of the union men to the quality of the mill. They recognized that this was therefore the climactic showdown between labor and capital. Journalists from around the world descended upon Homestead and reported on what was happening. Here's one example from Hungary, where local readers were well aware that their own people were caught in the middle. In 1892, the most important steel mill in the world became the scene of the most significant defeat for labor unions of that era. Thus, Homestead became the place to which journalists, historians, sociologists, artists, curators, heritage preservationists, and labor activists keep returning when they want to check in on the ever-evolving relationship between industry and labor. What got lost then was the stories of all the other people in Homestead. As the diverging destinies of the merchants and the steelworkers during the strike show, the economic possibilities in Homestead were more complicated than these flat narratives let on. Now let's turn to look more closely at the experiences of Jews in Homestead at this time. Isabel Grossman wrote in this Yiddish speech in 1901, quote, "Before our community was established, Homestead was, in terms of finding Jewish religion, tohu vavohu v'choshech, unformed and void and darkness." But then, as Isidore Grossman's brother reflected in 1944, quote, "The famous Homestead strike of 1892 put Homestead on the map and in the history of the United States. Thousands of people were attracted to Homestead. Naturally, the Jewish people were also attracted. And by 1893, we had about 12 Jewish families permanently established in Homestead." In 1893, they had their first Rosh Hashanah service in the neighborhood firehouse. And in March of 1894, Isidore Grossman wrote, "Mr. Sam Markowitz had a yahrzeit and wanted to recite Kaddish in memory of his father. He had difficulty in getting a minyan. Isidore S. Grossman remarked that it was a disgrace that a Jewish community the size of the one in Homestead should have no organized congregation." And so shortly thereafter, in March of 1894, they organized their congregation with 18 charter members. The first president was Segelman the jeweler. The first vice president was my great-grandfather. Rounding out the first officers were a couple of Sam Markowitzes and Isidore Grossman. They soon hired a rabbi and made their first attempt at organizing a Hebrew school. The economic headwinds in 1890s were against them, though. After the Panic of 1893, orders for steel were low, putting men out of work. Grossman wrote, "During this time period, disagreements occurred several times at the meetings related to the Great Panic that began in the United States, causing demoralization and diminishing of the congregation. Only 10 of the original 18 members remained. However, those who remained were strong, hardened, courageous, and steadfast." Despite these challenges, they slowly raised more money so that in 1896, my great-grandfather and Isidore Grossman could purchase land for the cemetery. To be clear, the Jews were not the only ethnic group to organize their community during this time. We see new churches and ethnic fraternal groups forming in all corners of Homestead's diverse population. Homestead rebounded from the panic sooner than other places in the United States. The mill began running in full for the first time in years during the summer of 1897, and each succeeding year brought more prosperity to Homestead than the year before. New stores were opening, new tracts of land went on the market for commercial and residential development, new buildings were going up everywhere, and new streetcar and railroad lines were linking Homestead's neighborhoods to each other and to all the surrounding towns and Pittsburgh. The steel mill expanded and an additional industry arrived, Mesta Machine and others. It is no wonder that it is during this period that the population of the Jewish community truly began to flourish. As this advertisement says, an army of 5,000 workmen means a population of at least 15,000 people. The grocer, the butcher, the baker, and a host of other tradespeople must be there to supply them with what they need. And a disproportionate number of the tradespeople who came to feed and clothe the workers continued to be Jewish. This all sounds very normal, but after the strike, Homestead was not a normal place. Democracy and civil liberties and freedom of speech were gone. It was not safe in Homestead to talk about the strike. It was not safe to talk about the union. It was not safe to even question the steel company. Workers were being spied on by company agents to prevent unionism from returning. A famous quote goes, "If you want to talk in Homestead, you talk to yourself." People who were blacklisted from one steel mill were blacklisted from all of them. Through two of the observers who came to Homestead after the strike, we get a view into what the town began. In 1894, this magazine published a 16-page, heavily illustrated description of the journalist Hamlin Garland's visit. He initially spoke about the town itself, and let me read you his description. The town was as squalid and unlovely as could well be imagined, and the people were mainly of the discouraged and sullen type, to be found everywhere where labor passes into the brutalizing stage of severity. It had the disorganized and incoherent effect of a town which has feeble public spirit. Such towns are sown thickly over the hilllands of Pennsylvania, but this was my first descent into one of them. They are American only in the sense in which they represent the American idea of business. He was really captivated by the process of making steel. He wrote, "I watched the men as they stirred the deeps beneath. I could not help admire the swift and splendid action of their bodies. They had the silence and certainty one imagines in the tiger's action." He quoted a steelworker saying, "It's a dog's life. Now those men work 12 hours and sleep and eat out 10 more. You can see a man don't have much time for anything else. You can't see your friends or do anything but work." Garland went on, "Everywhere in this enormous building were pits like the mouth of hell, and fierce ovens giving off a flare of heat, and burning wood and iron giving off horrible stenches of gases. Thunder upon thunder, clang upon clang, glare upon glare. Torches flamed far up in the dark spaces above. Engines moved to and fro, and steam hissed and threatened. Everywhere were grimy men with sallow and lean faces. The work was of the inhuman sort that hardens and coarsens." Hamlin Garland introduced the themes that we see in many accounts of steelworkers thereafter. The sheer awe of the unbelievable machinery. Garland called it gorgeous and dangerous. The hard work, the constant danger, the long work days, the low wages, the notion of mill owners as adversaries, and the lives of the steelworkers with no rest or recreation. This magazine followed up the next month with a 6.5-page article, Homestead as seen by one of its workmen, which followed much in the same vein. But this workman reflected on how the steelworkers lived. How do they stand it? How could any human being stand it? No one knows. They all die young. But Hamlin Garland's summation was more damning. He wrote, "Upon such toil rests the splendor of American civilization. Beside the beautiful river, the town and its industries lay like a cancer on the breast of a human body." The strike wasn't even 2 years past, but this is what was playing out in Homestead. When the steel industry rebounded at the turn of the century, the opportunities it created were shared unequally. The daily wages of the highly skilled workers at Homestead shrunk by 1/5 between 1892 and 1907, while their work shifts increased from 8 hours to 12 hours. The wages of the least skilled were now below poverty level, even though they too worked 12-hour shifts. Sociologist Margaret Byington wanted to know how it affected these families. She spent a year living in Homestead from 1907 to 1908. Her findings were published in 1909 and in full form in 1910, a lengthy volume that was accompanied by photographs and drawings. She wrote extensively about the ward, the poorest part of town, where most of the immigrant steelworkers lived, and notably where most of the Jewish community was clustered together. She wrote, the level ground in the ward was cut off from the river by the mill and from the country by the steep hill behind. It forms a pocket where the smoke settles heavily. From the cinder path beside one of the railroads that crosses the level part of Homestead, you enter an alley bordered on one side by stables and on the other by a row of shabby 2-story frame houses. The doors of the houses are closed, but dishpans and old cloths decorating their exterior mark them as inhabited. Turning from the alley through a narrow passageway, you find yourself in a small court, on 3 sides of which are smoke-grimed houses, and on the 4th, low stables. The open space teems with life and movement. Children, dogs, and hens make it lively underfoot. Overhead, long lines of flapping clothes must be dodged. A group of women stand gossiping in one corner, waiting their turn at the pump, which is one of the 2 sources of water supply for the 20 families who live here. Another woman dumps the contents of her wash tub upon the paved ground, and the greasy, soapy water runs into an open drain a few feet from the pump. In the center, a circular wooden building with 10 compartments opening into one vault. flushed only by this wastewater, constitutes the toilet accommodations for over 100 people. 27 children find in this crowded brick-paved space their only playground. This court is one of many such in Homestead. Accumulations of rubbish and broken brick pavements render the courts as a whole untidy and unwholesome. The houses are built close to the street with only this busy court behind. Dreary as is the exterior, however, the evils to the dwellers in the court lie deeper in the inadequate water supply, in meager toilet facilities, and in overcrowding. In addition to describing the public health crises running rampant in the town, she also spoke about why these conditions grew worse. First of all, she explained the tax gerrymandering that took place in town. There were now 3 boroughs instead of 1, Homestead in the middle, where most of the people lived, including the poorest people, with, as you can see from the shaded area, only a small bit of steel mill property. Then Munhall on the east, which was much more prosperous and had the bulk of the steel mill property. And then West Homestead on the west, which had Nest and Machine. And so Homestead in the middle had the least tax revenue from industry, and therefore the highest individual tax rates on its residents, who were, again, some of the poorest people of the 3 boroughs. She talked about how ineffective and corrupt local government was in Homestead. She noted that people didn't even bother to engage politically. It was futile. She noted the unchecked vice in the town. There were speakeasies and there were disorderly houses, which included a lively trade in sex work. And to be clear, these were problems that were in Homestead. They did not spread over to Munhall or West Homestead. And so these characteristics that I'm sharing now, they continue to define Homestead for decades. Against these conditions, we must juxtapose the developments of the Jewish community. The number of Jewish residents and merchants multiplied heading into the 20th century. There were more than 250 Jewish residents by 1900 and steep growth thereafter. The number of Jewish stores multiplied. Meyer Grinberg, the peddler who was teased for being short, and his brother opened their store. So did Lasdusky, the peddler who cried when he was arrested. And many more of their new neighbors, most of whom are recent immigrants with similarly humble origins. Over the course of a few years, the Jewish community raised money to build a synagogue. In addition to dues and selling seats, they had annual balls that gathered Jews from all over the neighboring towns, and even many leading non-Jews from Homestead. Such a group once again gathered together when the Jews of Homestead dedicated their synagogue on March 31st, 1902, which was Easter Day. This list of synagogue members from around this time period gives a picture of this community at this most auspicious moment. As you can see, they were all in trade. The majority had their own businesses, and you can see from this list some of the different industries in which they were represented. There was one saloon owner, that was my great-grandfather. At least 6 of them ranked amongst the leading merchants in all the town, including one of the town's 2 department stores. On their first Hanukkah in the new synagogue, the president of the congregation, Bernard Gluck, gave a remarkable speech about how well the Jewish community was doing 10 years after the strike. Let me read you some excerpts. He said, "We have special ground for joy and thankfulness at this festival because this is the first time we have had the chance to celebrate the Hanukkah feast in this, our own town, without hindrance and without coercion, here in the world, in this land of the brave and free. We are one organization, one family. Consequently, we are here not considered as foreigners, but as free American citizens. We love to praise our Heavenly Father for the success we have attained in this, our town. Not at the Theiss in Hungary, not at the Rhine in Germany, nor at the Volga of Russia have we erected our synagogue, but at the shores of the Monongahela it stands, on a solid foundation that gables high up heavenwards as a monument of humanity and brotherly love. Not with Hungarian Kirchen, not with German marks, nor with Russian rubles have we erected our temple, but with good, honest American dollars we have accomplished this. Even so, in our feastly mood, we must not forget that our wealth and early possessions we have all acquired in this great commonwealth, in this famous town, Homestead. My friends, not only in ancient times, but also recently, we have seen miracles performed. We are all aware that none of us came to this town the possessor to any extent of earthly wealth. And now, through thrift, industry, and indulgence, we all have accumulated a certain amount of wealth, and all are more or less in easy circumstances. We all prosper in business. The majority of us own our own homes. And we as a congregation also possess a mortgageless synagogue, which is a miracle in itself. Therefore, there is ground enough for us in memory of the suffering of olden times, compared with the liberty and prosperity we enjoy at present, to celebrate the feast of Hanukkah and make it a pleasant, joyful day, with hope that we may live in happiness and prosperity and see many happy returns of this day. The rapid advance of that first generation of Jewish residents in Homestead is undeniable. Maurice Frankel ran a clothing store and made his fortune investing in local real estate. He became Homestead's first Jewish councilman in 1907 after a couple of attempts which had some pretty blatant anti-Semitism involved. He had been a peddler when a synagogue was organized. Now, according to the newspaper, he was, quote, one of the richer men in town whose, quote, success has been entirely due to his own efforts. The Grimberg brothers split up and they ran their own store. Maurice, who's pictured here, the mustache in the top middle, he sold clothing and Meyer home goods. H.L. and Ben Little, the ones that I just flashed, were two of the three little brothers who had shoe stores on 8th Avenue. Benjamin Friedlander had a ladies' clothing store, and Joseph Lasdusky had the leading ladies' clothing store. He was the first Jew elected to the school board in 1906. He became president of the school board in 1910, and he was responsible for building up the high school building. The newspaper wrote, "It doesn't often occur that a candidate for public office receives the unanimous vote of his own party at the primaries, and then to be given the unsolicited endorsement of the leading opposition party. It shows that the man so honored must have been qualifying himself through many years of past private and business life to receive such singular tokens of confidence and appreciation." Jews attained other leading positions at this time in these early years as well. There was a Jewish policeman. There were even Jewish bank directors. The majority of early synagogue members had stories like these. The newspaper talked about them as well-known, progressive, and enterprising. Their businesses were first-class, successful, and attractive. One was eulogized as highly respected by all who knew him. He was a fair-minded man and made friends with all whom he came in contact. And so the sheer weight of the evidence in the town's newspaper shows that there was a clear place for Homestead's Jewish residents, a place where they could fit in, a place where they could rise. They joined the town's businessmen association and later spearheaded a more active and more progressive rival organization to boost trade in the town. They joined non-sectarian lodges and sometimes even served there as officers. Their children too were advancing rapidly. From the beginning, the Jewish community's kids were graduating high school, girls were going to teachers' college, and even some boys to four-year college. Councilman Frankel's son went to Harvard in 1908 and then went on to Harvard Law School, returning afterwards to practice law in Homestead. Before 1905, there were a couple of Homestead boys at pharmacy school and a couple more medical school. All of these were boys who had immigrated as children. We all know the shape of this narrative, but it really strikes me just how quickly and thoroughly it happened in Homestead. And it's worth noting again that their non-Jewish immigrant neighbors who worked for the steel mill had a very different experience. It wasn't just the low wages and the poverty. To the extent to which the paper reflected public opinion, no one could escape the regular reminder that the Eastern European immigrants were their inferiors. Newspaper stories abounded, suggesting that they were ignorant, unclean, violent, and drunk, or at least seemed so to their neighbors. On the other hand, the newspaper wrote the Hebrews of Homestead, as a rule, are a class of people who do credit to the town. Diverging paths, indeed. And so Homestead, this broken town, did make room for Jewish residents to flourish. But there was anti-Semitism too, though. It was harder to put a finger on it. Some claimed that they encountered it often, while others, like Jacob Rader Marcus, yes, that historian, Jacob Rader Marcus, who grew up there, claimed that he did not. Each person's experience was unique. But we do see evidence in the newspaper that suggests the things that just weren't recorded from people's memories. When the paper wrote about peddlers running into trouble, was that because they were Jewish? When a 3-year-old boy was hit with a brick, when an older boy was hit with a rock, when a grown man was beaten up, when 3 Jewish boys were tricked into missing their high school graduation, was this anti-Semitism or was this something else at play? Surely in 1904, this epithet that Dave Segelman was called before his friend attacked him, surely whatever that vile epithet was some sort of anti-Semitic slur, right? And what about from one of the times that Frankel was involved in an election when somebody wrote a long newspaper screed against them, calling them sheenies who were being used? And probably the most significant event for consideration was the arson of the first synagogue building, of which they had been so proud. The congregation believed the culprit to be, quote, an enemy of their race. And the town accused them of destroying their own synagogue for the insurance money. This, though, gave them an opportunity to rebuild their synagogue on 10th Avenue in the area where all of the most prestigious churches were centered. And so at this time, they were able to afford a much larger building, although in time, it would prove not to be even large enough. With the growing community, the synagogue was not the only Jewish organization in Homestead. Jews wanted places of their own to socialize, to do philanthropy, to educate their children in Jewish traditions, and connect them to other Jewish children. In 1899, they formed their first social club. In 1902, a political club. In 1903, a Zion Society. In 1904, their first B'nai B'rith chapter. In 1905, the ladies organized as an auxiliary of the synagogue. There was a boys basketball team in 1906, Sunday school in 1907. In 1910, they organized a chapter of the Young Women's Hebrew Association. It took the boys 4 more years to organize their chapter of the Young Men's Hebrew Association. But the boys beat them with the Boy Scouts in early 1919, but the Girl Scouts followed later that year. There were so many Jewish organizations in town that they had to form another Jewish organization to coordinate all of their activities. You can see in this bar graph why they needed a much bigger synagogue in 1914 from what they thought that they needed in 1901, and why they could support so many organizations. The community's growth in these early years was, as you can see, significant. But even as Gluck was extolling the success of the community in 1902, new Jewish immigrants were pouring into Homestead. They were starting at the beginning, just as the early arrivals had some years prior. Alongside the prosperous 8th Avenue shopkeepers that we heard about were newer arrivals with smaller groceries and confectionaries or still packs on their back. And yes, some did find work in the steel mills for a time, but very few made a career out of it. Some of these Jewish families lived in the immigrant courts of the ward under those same conditions that Byington described. While some Jewish merchants were able to move up the hill to the nicer part of Homestead, that's the area that's below the blue line on this map, most did not, as you can see. Most stayed below the tracks, even those who were prospering. It was more pleasant to live amongst other Jews. All throughout its history, the Jewish community of Homestead had friction between its haves and have-nots. There was just one synagogue that they all had to share, but some of the families there were outright wealthy and some truly struggled. The themes established in this first decade of the Jewish community in Homestead, they hold throughout the history of the community, and I'm not going to keep touching upon them in the interest of time. The shopkeeping, the focus on education, the development of Jewish social and philanthropic organizations, the rise into the middle class, the inclusion in business circles, and the anti-Semitism along the way. What we see by 1920 in Homestead is a community within a community, the Jewish immigrants within the larger group of Eastern European immigrants, following quite a different trajectory. Scholars don't talk about Homestead as a place where immigrants of this era thrived. And yet here we see that some did, if they did not tie their economic fortunes directly to the steel mill. Homestead rewarded entrepreneurism much more than it did a capacity for the hardest kinds of labor. It is uncomfortable to look at these narratives side by side. It raises questions for both groups. It doesn't fit neatly into received narratives about Homestead, but it is what happened. And there's one more layer that I need to add on about how life in Homestead played out after the strike, where Jewish people fit in an unexpected way. So going back to Byington's book, which did in fact shape an enduring image about life in Homestead, Homestead was well aware about how it was represented, or as they said in the paper, shamefully misrepresented, and they resented that only its worst parts were shown to the world. And so a story that rarely gets told about Homestead from this period was the attempts of its own townspeople to ameliorate the conditions of their neighbors. In an age without a social safety net from the government or proliferation of nonprofits, it was the civic responsibility of the better off homesteaders to look after their neighbors. The end of this article that you see pictured here says, after reading it, get busy and do something for the good of the town. And so the people most expected to get busy were the town's businessmen. They were managers of the steel mill, up to and including the superintendent in their capacity as individuals. There were professionals, the town's doctors and lawyers and bankers and real estate agents, but the largest class were the town's merchants, who had a vested interest in the life of the place where they sold. They wanted to ensure that their shops remained in a large, vibrant community. In the early 20th century, merchants were extremely visible in a way they mostly are not today. Shopping was largely local, and walking down 8th Avenue, the main business thoroughfare, was popular recreation for the town's residents, and it drew people in from the nearby boroughs and the township. Most stores, as we saw from some of those advertisements, were named after their proprietors, and merchants became prominent beyond their actual social station through those means. To become a merchant gave a person a chance to become one of Homestead's civic leaders. It was an amazing integration opportunity for Homestead's Jews, and they were enthusiastic to participate to show their civic spirit and their hometown pride. One of the most significant efforts spearheaded by the town itself was the establishment of its own hospital, founded in 1903 and expanded in 1907. At the time of this expansion, the Jewish community stepped up en masse. And the newspaper wrote, quote, "If the other nationalities would only do as well, Homestead would soon have a fine hospital. The Hebrews of Homestead are showing themselves to be a charitable people. The way in which they are responding to the call for contributions to the hospital should put the other nationalities, including the Americans, to shame." The steel industry often went through contractions, as we've already seen, during which many workers were employed part-time, if at all. In the decades after the strike, significant industrial depressions spurred the businessmen to organize their own local relief efforts. Once after the Panic of 1907, and again after the start of World War I, they threw benefits to raise money, printing the names of donors in the newspaper as a kind of peer pressure, and organized a system to disperse the funds. Here again, we see the merchants, Jewish and non, stepping up to lead and contribute to these efforts. General relief efforts like these were only the tip of the iceberg. The businessmen and their wives started a summer playground and a community day nursery to look after children. They organized a curb market, we call that a farmer's market, to bring in fresh fruits and vegetables. They lobbied borough council around many of the basic services of the town. And the town's newspaper and even representatives of local groups, like the crusading reverend of the Hungarian Church, asked them directly for their assistance. This was how things got done in Homestead. The thing is, this isn't a narrative that you'll read about anywhere else. You'll read that the businessmen joined the steel industry in social control, saying that the businessmen all came from a middle-class Protestant cultural context. But we've seen it's actually more complicated than that. You'll see claims that people help themselves through their own organizations, some of which are pictured here, and claims that when people received aid, they were resented by how it was given to them. And I'm sure that all those dynamics were truly at play in Homestead. But for Homestead's Jewish community, the very fact that there were town-wide attempts at charity and that these efforts made space for them and celebrated their participation, this was a big deal. It was part of the story of how they came to feel so proud to be homesteaders and to be Americans. And it truly mattered to them that the average homesteader be able to get by, not just because they had all come from poverty themselves, but because they depended on their customers. This is part of the bankruptcy file of my great uncle, and this is a representative case. He sold on credit to the Hungarian laborers in the steel mill, and at the time he went bankrupt, he was owed more by his customers than he owed to his creditors. If they could have paid him, he wouldn't have gone bankrupt. The merchants and the mill workers depended on each other. The merchants depended on the mill workers to be their customers, and the mill workers depended on the merchants to sell them on credit when times were lean and carry them from payday to payday. And both depended on the steel mill to continue to provide work so that money would continue to flow through these channels. Hard times in the mill affected all homesteaders. As went the mill, so went the town. The fact, though, is that nothing the town or its businessmen did could overcome the underlying issues that steelworkers were paid poverty wages. During World War I, the workers hit production records again and again. After the war, the drop in steel demand led to attempts on the part of the steel industry to cut jobs and wages. In response, steelworkers nationwide tried to unionize. The Great Steel Strike of 1919 brought violence once more to the streets of Homestead. Here we see a policeman from the Coal and Iron Police beating a Homestead shopkeeper on just the second day of the strike. But this time the steel company was in charge of the narrative from the get-go and convinced everyone that the strike was Bolshevik and it came from the foreign element. Propaganda like this disingenuous advertisement made the strike seem like it wasn't an affair of American workers. It turned native-born and immigrant steelworkers against each other and turned the average American against the strike. The strike failed in January of 1920, and of course, conditions worsened in Homestead. With the Great Migration, Homestead was becoming more diverse and poorer, and with Prohibition, crime was rising. The fact is that the living conditions in Homestead had never been great, and the perception in the 1920s was that the town was becoming increasingly unsafe. It is against this backdrop that we see the otherwise unexpected early peak of the Jewish population in Homestead in the early 1920s. So what was going on? For one thing, we can see from the way this graph is color-coded just how much the growth of Homestead's Jewish community came from immigration. When immigration was cut off to the country in the 1920s, there were not enough new people arriving to replace those who were leaving. And the 1920s was also when we start seeing the beginnings of the Jewish community moving away from Homestead. And there were push and pull factors that led Jews to leave. A community member from a later generation reflected on something that was true even in this period. He said, quote, "It seems to me the problem with Homestead was not one kid ever returned. Once they grew up, they left Homestead. And as their parents grew older, they left the area or they died and nothing was replaced. Not one kid ever returned to Homestead." Some married people from outside of Homestead and brought them into the community, but more often education and marriage and job opportunities took them away. So those were the pulls. But there were some serious quality of life issues in Homestead that were part of the push. I mentioned the poverty and the crime. I also want to note the issue with water. No one in Homestead, rich or poor, had reliable, clean water. The state government condemned Homestead twice for its water quality. The newspaper documented that people literally moved from Homestead in search of drinkable water. The deep racial and economic divisions that the 1919 strike had stoked paved the way for the nativism of the 1920s. The Klan became active in Homestead and the region. While the feeling is that the Klan was more concerned with Blacks and Catholics than with Jews, Jewish families on their way to synagogue on Friday would pass them marching in full regalia. They burned crosses in the hills around the time. But still, there was also more commonplace anti-Semitism. The children feared to walk past the churches where they would be taunted or attacked. They were called Žid, Christ killer, goddamn Jew. The teachers would pick on Jewish students who didn't sing the Christmas carols or who took off for Jewish holidays. The Jews remembered their fellow Eastern European immigrants as the worst. They brought their anti-Semitism with them from the old country. In Europe, the Jew was always on the bottom, no matter how rich or poor. But in Homestead, Jews were rising where non-Jews were not able to. It upended the order of things, and it was hard. There's one more pull that I need to add. It happens to be that Homestead is directly across the river from the Squirrel Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh, which was then the growing center of middle-class Jewish life. While the Homestead Synagogue remained Orthodox, the new synagogue in Squirrel Hill, Beth Shalom, felt modern in comparison. And so the fact is that a lot of non-Jewish middle-class homesteaders were moving to Squirrel Hill in this time period and had been for more than a decade. So the Jews were part of that larger trend for both general reasons as well as reasons very specific to their community. Of Homestead's Jewish community, 6 Jewish households transplanted in the teens and 65 in the 20s. The departure slowed somewhat during the worst years of the Depression, but even with the shrinking Jewish population, the Homestead Jewish community's institutions remained strong. Jewish synagogue membership, was actually growing. Somebody who grew up in that time recalled, "You do have to remember in the Depression years, the shul was a source of great entertainment, and it was very central to our lives. They were difficult times, and the entertainment all centered around the shul." Another woman who grew up then recalled, "This was our home away from home. Our parents worked all day and they went home and they had dinner and then they would get together, they'd have a board meeting, or they would have a special meeting for this, or they'd have a seat committee meeting, or it was always something, but it was always the shul. That was the hub. There wasn't television and you read your newspaper or you listened to radio, but there was always something going on at the synagogue." The Depression was significantly worse in Homestead than other places. 50% of Homestead steelworkers were unemployed. Those who were unemployed only worked part-time. Those who were employed, only worked part-time in an effort to keep every man, or as many men as possible, receiving at least some wages. But the Depression made possible what had otherwise seemed unattainable previously. The National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 provided for collective bargaining, and the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, required businesses to bargain in good faith with any union supported by the majority of their employees. On January 5th, 1936, the 44th anniversary of the strike, the union organized a big rally in Homestead in a renewed campaign to organize steelworkers. There was a reason why they picked that date and that place. A local steelworker, Italian by birth, got up on stage and read the Steelworkers' Declaration of Independence. Like him, most of the men there were immigrants or the children of immigrants. "We are free Americans. We shall exercise our inalienable rights to organize into a great industrial union, banded together with all our fellow steelworkers." U.S. Steel saw the writing on the wall. 9 months later, the union was back in the Homestead Works. On Labor Day in 1941, the union dedicated a monument in memory of the workers who had died during the strike. Almost a half-century later, the union had taken back their own narrative. They could fearlessly tell the world what their history meant to them. But this climactic dedication happened right before the heart was ripped out of Homestead, when half of Homestead was demolished to expand the steel mill. To explain, before 1941, these areas were the steel mill, the ones highlighted in yellow. And this 121-acre region in the middle is the ward, the immigrant neighborhood you've been hearing about. And so in 1940, the federal government had decided to invest $75 million in expanding the capabilities of the existing Homestead Works as part of a larger plan to ramp up the country's industrial production capabilities. As you can see, the ward in the middle had to go to make room for the new mills. The people of Homestead were compelled to vacate. Property owners were forced to sell at whatever price the government offered. 75% were renters about to become homeless during a county-wide housing shortage. The displaced families largely did not protest. There was huge pressure on people to do their patriotic duty. Clergymen spoke in favor of it from their pulpits. One scholar called this a quiet sacrifice for the greater good. The greater good being America or the war, I suppose, but America wasn't in the war when all this got underway. In fact, the demolition was quite far along when Pearl Harbor actually took place. The truth is that an expanded steel mill meant an expanded workforce with increased hours, and 75% of the ward's families were steel families. It was a huge sacrifice to lose their neighborhood and their community, a loss that echoed for decades. But what they got in return through the expanded steel mill was permanent economic stability, or so it seemed. Jewish people, as we saw earlier, had already been moving out of Lower Homestead or leaving Homestead altogether. Of the almost 1,600 families displaced from Lower Homestead, 26 of them were Jewish. You can see the drop in the community's population here in the bar graph. The displaced Jewish households, like many of the ward's residents, had been there for some time. This included my own family, families who had deep, long-standing ties to the town. Half of them found new homes elsewhere in Homestead. They still wanted to be there. 2/3 of Jews in the ward had owned their homes, far more than the rate amongst their neighbors. And most of the ward's Jewish households lost their businesses along with their homes and rental income properties as well. When the government and the steel mill claimed Lower Homestead, they wiped out the progress that many families, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and especially those headed by first generation and older adults, the progress those families had made in building individual and generational wealth. The war brought record employment and record wages to Homestead. Unlike after World War I, production after World War II kept up. There was a substantial market for steel appliances, automobiles, farm machines, and more. U.S. Steel produced more steel in 1950 than it had at its wartime peak. The steelworkers went on strike in 1946 for higher wages. This time, there was no violent confrontation, and they got the wages they wanted. U.S. Steel passed the costs along to the American consumer. Throughout the 1950s, the mill ran at full capacity, and money poured into Homestead through the mill. The median income of Homestead was 26% higher than the rest of the county at this time. And 8th Avenue was in its prime. The stores attracted shoppers from all over Steel Valley, many of them former Homestead residents. Saturday night, 8th Avenue was the place to see and be seen. People dressed up and the sidewalks were thick with people. The stores on 8th Avenue continued to be run, many by Jewish merchants, though increasingly those merchants lived outside of Homestead and commuted in. You walked down 8th Avenue and it was a parade of Jewish names: Rubin, Linkoff, Grinberg, Gold, Wolfson, Hilk, Levine, Friedlander, Marx, Margolis, Haff, Solomon. Through the years of the borough organizing its own relief efforts were past, these men that I named and their fellow businessmen remained active in civic life. The fire chief was Jewish. There were Jewish mill cops. Even the assistant football coach was Jewish. So was the leading racketeer and the leading madam. But in 1950, a Pittsburgh grand jury finally put an end to decades of vice and corruption in Homestead. In another way, Homestead broke with its past in this period. It remained as always a patchwork of different ethnicities, but it was less and less defined by unassimilated foreigners. People of the same ethnic origin clung together, but increasingly they shared an identity as steelworkers, union members, and homesteaders that flattened out the differences of the past. A couple generations of American-born kids with Eastern European roots had come up in school and then the mill together. For all the angst of previous generations of homesteaders about why their foreigners remained so resolutely foreign, all that it took was opportunity, both work and education, and familiarity. But it got harder for the Jewish families who remained there because there were fewer of them, and they were more isolated socially. They didn't fit neatly in the pattern of homestead life that was emerging. My cousin told me a story when he was in high school, and the high school overlooked the steel mill. He was standing there with a classmate, and his classmate said, "I don't even know why I'm here. I'm just going to go in the mill, just like my father." There were two different communities living side by side with two different outlooks on what it took to thrive. Here's the thing, while the Jewish population of Homestead was shrinking somewhat in the 50s, its synagogue membership actually boomed after the war. And an increasing number of residents were people who had moved out of Homestead, as you can see from the red in that second bar graph. You can see that this trend begins even back in the 1920s when Jews first began moving out. Leaving Homestead for Jewish people did not mean cutting ties. The people that I talked to today remember the bustle of activity in the 50s and the early 60s in the Jewish community. They remember a synagogue that was standing room only, a Hebrew school that was teeming with children, a sisterhood that cooked elaborate kiddushes and dinners in the shul kitchen. They remembered meetings in the synagogue vestry rooms during the week, B'nai B'rith men and women, AZA, BBYO, Hadassah, Israel Bonds, Jewish Word Vets, Young Judea, and all kinds of synagogue committees. But to explain what happened next, I gotta go back to that bar graph. And sorry for people who don't like bar graphs as much as I do. But here finally is the full bar graph showing synagogue membership changes over time. We can see here that synagogue membership peaked in the early 50s as we discussed, but then dropped very quickly thereafter. The colors in this version, which divide members by how they are related to each other, begin to explain why. Purple indicates what I call first generation members, people without any pre-existing connection to the community. Each person who arrives in the community has the potential to seed multiple generations of members. When we look at the other colors, we see why this is important. The orange are children of earlier members who grew up and joined themselves. Turquoise are people who joined after marrying children who grew up in the community, and so on. When the purple part of the graph shrinks, when new people fail to put down roots in Homestead, the community loses out at that moment in the future. But the next graph will show us, with some context, why the purple shrank, why there stopped being new first generation members. This time, the colors show where a synagogue member was living in a given year. As we saw before, blue means that the member lived in Homestead. Blue bodes well for that year and beyond. Red means that the member lived nearby in Pittsburgh, and the other colors are other places further afield. People like to go to LA and Miami in those days. These people, the non-blue, are what I call legacy members, whether retirees or grown children who retain their loyalty to their family congregation, but who live their daily lives in probably a larger Jewish community with many more Jewish options. These members did not beget more members. Their children knew their families were from Homestead, but they did not affiliate with the Homestead Synagogue. They invested in the communities in which they lived. And so if you look closely, you'll see that in 1950, the number of members residing in Homestead dropped below 50% for the first time and continued to drop from there. The number of legacy members came to dominate the overall membership. A woman who was born in Homestead, who raised her children there in the 50s and 60s, commented on why her friends moved out. She said, "The people who stayed had family here and wanted to stay with their family. And the people who did not looked toward the future and knew that it would never be, that it had peaked, And for their children and grandchildren, they wanted a more Jewish environment, such that Squirrel Hill or East End had offered them. Quite frankly, they wanted their kids not to face anti-Semitism at school and have other Jewish friends who helped them feel proud of being Jewish. One kid who who lived in Homestead at this time, Jeff Goldblum. It wasn't just Jews who were leaving Homestead, and I want to emphasize that because of the way that this gets remembered later. After the destruction of the ward and the expansion of the steel mill and increased wages and better roads and bridges and cars, steelworkers didn't need to live in walking distance of the mill anymore. Increasingly, steelworkers lived further out in nicer places and drove in. There was a crush of cars coming and going at shift change. The population of Homestead, already halved from the destruction of the ward, dropped 25% more between 1950 and 1960, 16% between 1960 and 1970, and 19% between 1970 and 1980. A lot of people were leaving. Homestead was also concerned with the sharply declining number of stores. In 1954, there were a third as many stores as there had been in 1939. They created this master plan to reverse blight and make the community more livable. Their plan was to tear down 8th Avenue and build a heliport over 7th Avenue. And the fact that a firm was actually paid to produce this suggests a really interesting concept of what people thought Homestead was or could be in those days. But seriously, with the lack of intervention, the business district went into a terminal decline in the 1960s. Somebody who lived in Homestead at that time recalled, "When I first knew Homestead, the stores were still very nice. The street was busy. That declined as transportation improved and as shopping malls were built. And that's what hurt all these little towns. And as the business declined, the Jewish merchants left," he went on, "and the Jewish community declined. The steel industry started laying people off in the 1970s, which hastened the decline of Homestead and its people. More stores closed. Arsons became a problem." As the steel industry declined, resistance rose up once more on the part of the workers, and once again, it centered in Homestead. This time, steelworkers told their own story alongside the outside journalists who took an interest. Homestead's Local 1397 transformed itself into a militant local of the United Steelworkers and resisted the dismantling of the steel industry. The steel company and their own union were not supportive. But U.S. Steel was not acting in good faith. There were a lot of challenges in the steel industry then, but what rankled workers the most was that for decades, U.S. Steel had refused to reinvest in the mills, choosing instead to invest elsewhere. In 1981, well into the industry contraction, U.S. Steel purchased Marathon Oil for $6 billion, and at the same time, they began laying people off in Steel Valley. Industrial America was collapsing, but as always, journalists centered their attention, particularly as to what was happening in Homestead. And Homestead Local 1397 was keenly aware of what it meant to be the local from Homestead. The eyes of the world were back on Homestead, and Homestead steelworkers were making headlines once more. The efforts of the local were innovative. They created alliances between labor and the community to fight for jobs. They made efforts to find investors to make it possible for workers to buy the mill and operate it themselves. As layoffs increased, they organized efforts to support unemployed workers and their families. Their spirited activism only increased, and it drew negative attention to U.S. Steel. In 1986, U.S. Steel closed the Homestead Works for good. Punishment, they claimed, for the locals' resistance. From 1979 until 1986, U.S. Steel alone, in the Mon Valley alone, eliminated 27,000 steelworker jobs. I'll quote Mike Stout, who was part of these efforts and published a book about them a couple years ago. For me, he writes, 1892 and 1982 are part of a whole, 2 points on the same pole of resistance and spirit of solidarity that sprang up, thrived, and was eventually suffocated at the great Homestead steel mill. The only way the Union flame could be permanently extinguished at Homestead was by pulling the floor out from underneath us, shutting down the whole thing, and erasing our important historic contributions. The waning years of the Homestead Works were the waning years for the Homestead Hebrew congregation. This ad makes me terribly sad. This once glorious community reduced to begging people to come. Jews left Homestead, but Homestead did not leave their hearts. In 1988, a woman who didn't even grow up in Homestead wanted to be married in the shul that was so important to her parents and grandparents. The members spruced up the building for a final hurrah, but the building needed too many repairs. and they still had a cemetery to fund and keep up. In 1991, they couldn't get a minion to commit to coming for holiday services, and that was it. In late 1992, they found themselves a buyer for the building just before a slew of local churches came on the market. The Jews of Homestead may exist now only as a diaspora, but we Jews are good at diaspora identity. For us, the name of the town still brings a smile and a rush of stories. Jewish families still come back to Homestead to see where their family's American story started. And the community still keeps up the tradition of cemetery visitation before the high holidays. What does it mean to thrive in America? The closing of the steel mill in 1986 brought a renewed surge of scholarly interest in the town to answer this question. Could Homestead once again provide insight at a time when a way of life, factory jobs that paid middle-class wages, was passing? Historians organized a museum exhibit in 1989 about life in the town. Accompanying the exhibit was a book about life in Homestead. The book mentioned Jews twice, once because the author was quoting Margaret Byington, and once to point out that the town's leading racketeer was Jewish. The entire Jewish community in Homestead reduced to its most notorious member. Somehow, the author wrote an entire section on corner stores and saloons without mentioning any Jews, which is confounding. Somehow he reminisced about the once lively and prosperous 8th Avenue business district without acknowledging who helped make it so. A few years later, the community came together to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Homestead strike. The New York Times reporter responsible for the coverage of the closing of the Homestead work wrote a book which he published in time for that commemoration. Again, looking at Homestead as a place where people lived. His book pairs erasure with borderline anti-Semitism. He mentioned Jews twice and the synagogue once, and that's it in a very large book. In both mentions of Jews, he asserts that Jews didn't live in Homestead but in Squirrel Hill. Defining Jews solely by their later absence in this way is deceptive. He acknowledged that the town did have a synagogue, though he singled it out for being, quote, hardly used anymore, which was true, but the same could have been said of many of the churches that he named, a slew of which the diocese was about to close from declining use. In a couple sections about Homestead's main business during its heyday, he singles out 17 businesses, 11 of which were owned by Jews. He talked about Club Mirador, a famous nightclub which had black and white performers and accepted black and white patrons. That was Joe Frank's place. No word of those being Jewish contributions. My cousin who grew up in Homestead shared his feelings about this in 1993. He said, I was very unhappy with it, and so was my brother, because I really think he slighted us. There's the Katzes and a few other families left, but he didn't make contact with them, and he wrote a description and practically left us out to begin with. He made a point of saying that the whole Jewish community migrated to Squirrel Hill. They crossed the river, as he put it, to live a better life or something, and that wasn't true, because as I pointed out, my brother was there, and there was quite a few families, and the congregation was active, and maintained a rabbi probably into the 80s, and so I was disturbed by that. He dismissed us, really, and we were an important part. Miner and Seren follow in the footsteps of their predecessors. They center the voices of steelworkers and their families, people who have previously been silenced. They write from a place of working class solidarity, Seren especially, but the results are to flatten the dimensions of what Homestead actually was. The limited narratives about Homestead, as we saw, started in a period when steelworkers couldn't safely tell their own stories about themselves, but at least they were heroes in the narratives that others told. And when they started telling their own stories, they adopted the previous tropes. As to why those tropes persisted, I want to offer a theory by way of a 1996 paper about Homestead, which tried to get at the truth of race relations between Black and white homesteaders. The authors reported that, quote, people we met in Homestead praised the town for its tolerance, conveying this through vivid images of a community without strife outside the mill walls. But after speaking to Black and white homesteaders with quite different memories, they concluded, the notion of Homestead as tolerant can be seen for what it was, a hegemonic characterization embraced by white ethnics. It's very easy for people to paint one view of events if another group is given no voice. The researchers then asked a question that is quite close to the one I've been asking all this time. Why have so many observers chosen to avoid the issue of racism in Homestead? Their response? Part of the answer must lie with Homestead's reputation as a heroic working class town. To many, this town of strikes and manly workers creating steel in a dangerous environment represents the essence of workers in the annals of American history. Racism would tarnish the heroic image. I would like to posit that this heroic image stands in the way of learning all the historic lessons that Homestead has to teach us. The heroic image blocks an honest accounting of all the economic opportunities in Homestead. It turns out that in Homestead, the surest way to find stable economic footing was to not tie one's fate directly to the mill. This is a hard lesson. The decades of union control where workers prospered alongside the mill were an exception. And the families who became almost middle class in those years, to quote a steelworker who Saren quoted, were left utterly abandoned by US Steel. Anyone who lives in Western Pennsylvania knows that US Steel is still playing games with Western Pennsylvania, and people still fall for them, so this is still relevant. The heroic image blocks an honest accounting of support structures. Who created them, who managed them, why people cared, if they cared enough. We can learn from the attempts at civic engagement and neighborly solidarity today more than ever. So that's, I guess, my scholarly conclusion, but it particularly concerns me as a Jew living in Squirrel Hill that the heroic image blocks an honest accounting of how people actually got along in a broken place and blocks a real assessment of who was permitted to assimilate and who was not, who was included and who was not, and why. There was both more and less solidarity than we tell ourselves today. Homestead, through the way its history gets told, symbolizes the improbable town worker solidarity that they relied upon even before the strike. And those threads still could be traced through. And there could be that solidarity again. And I want to end by naming an organization, the organization that to me cares most about carrying the torch of the meaning of Homestead. And this is the Battle of Homestead Foundation, which was created by many of the steelworkers from Local 1397, whom you heard about before, who had been so active in those waning years, along with a number of others who were inspired around the time of the 100th anniversary of the strike to use a vision of Homestead's history to better the world. They've hung onto a vision of labor activism that is even more expansive than just labor, that can inspire real social change. It's an amazing legacy of Homestead that people meet every Wednesday for breakfast to talk about Homestead. And this includes guests who come in from around the world, who come together to breathe the spirit of 1892, to look history in the face and carry forward its best and learn from its worst. I'm honored to call them my friends. And knowing them has transformed the work that I've been doing to tell my community's corner of Homestead history. And quite frankly, without them, I would have never even thought to create a talk like this one to pair the narratives together. Our mutual efforts to incorporate each other's narratives of Homestead shows that history needn't be a zero-sum game. We can tell each other's stories. We can braid them together in narratives where the lessons are a bit more complicated and the lines are a bit less clean, but where there is more to learn because the narrative is closer to what really was and is closer to what really is today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy, for such an engaging and insightful lecture about Homestead. I think you can go ahead and close your PowerPoint. And I particularly appreciated how you uncovered some untold stories of the Jewish community in Homestead, and how these stories, some of these stories relate to other stories that we've heard, but there's also so much unique about this narrative that you told us today. I wonder, just to open up questions, everyone can go ahead now and start typing in more questions if you have them, but I wanted to open up if you want to tell a little bit more of your you mentioned your family and your story, but I wonder if you want to tell a little more of your story and sort of where you are now today.
Sure. So I think it became clear my great-grandfather was there early, but I did not grow up in Western Pennsylvania. I was born in Philadelphia and grew up in South Jersey, and shout out to my Philadelphia ancestors on the other side. But my dad is a storyteller, and he would tell me stories about his great-grandfather in the Homestead Shul. And I honestly didn't really believe that they were true. I thought he was telling me things that I wanted to hear. And so the very slow process from my childhood to my young adulthood was learning how to find the people and do the research and ask the questions and get answers, which proved that actually the story was even more incredible than the bits and pieces that my father had shared with me. And so you saw a picture earlier in the talk in 1910 of what was actually my first visit to Western Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Homestead. I saw the synagogue that my great-grandfather built. I saw the cemetery that he helped to found with Heppses on stones everywhere you look. And it was a life-changing experience. It took 4 years to figure out what to do with all of that energy that I left Pittsburgh with on that day. But I eventually moved to Pittsburgh for a year to look at all the surviving synagogue records. You saw some of them in the talk closer to the beginning. And, read them all through and see the story and figure out, where my great-grandfather fit in, and then go back to my real life, which was as a technology executive in New York City. But that maybe it's like Mars years, because that 1 year is now extended into 8 years, and I'm still here. I live in Squirrel Hill. I'm a member of Beth Shalom, the synagogue that I mentioned earlier. And at this point, I'd like to call myself a fifth-generation Pittsburgher who wasn't born here, because it really connects to the way that I see myself and see myself in this community, even though by Pittsburgh standards, I'm still a newcomer.
That's great. Thanks for sharing. I see a couple of questions here about asking about the relationship between Blacks and Jews and Homestead, and sort of where the Black community stood. If you want to say more about that.
I'll give you a few anecdotes that I've gleaned from different sources. That cousin that I quoted towards the end, his brother, who was not around when I started asking questions to get more of the story, wrote down a fragment of a story that my great-grandfather lived next to and was friends with a former slave in Homestead. I wish that I knew more of that story. All that I have is that fragment, but it's really kind of unbelievable to think about a young man who left Hungary and a former slave living side by side in this place. Jews and Blacks did live side by side in the ward, especially after the Great Migration. There was a growing Black population in Homestead, especially in Lower Homestead, where the Jews were clustered. I should note there was an older Black population that lived up on the hill and lived more middle-class lives that were not possible for the more recent arrivals. There was definitely racism on the part of the Jews that comes through. I would have to say that was probably part of the factor in why some of them moved out of Lower Homestead. There's some people who say that Jewish barkeepers, same as non-Jewish barkeepers, segregated their bars and permitted white patrons. I think that's probably true. I think Jews went along with what was going along there. Most of them probably did. But they sold to Black customers. They lived in the same neighborhoods. They were there's a sort of funny story that I heard of a woman who had Black people working for her in the store, and somehow they understood just enough Yiddish that she could talk to them, or they, sort of tolerated what she was saying and smiled and nodded. I'll conclude with stories from my father. You grow up with stories, you don't realize how unusual they are until you take a step back and reflect. I mentioned a little bit about the whorehouses of Homestead. Those figured in my father's childhood stories of Homestead, which I did not realize how weird that was until later. But my father also spoke very glowingly of the Black people that he knew in Homestead from that time. He said that they were much harder workers than anybody else who worked for his father's business, as my father did when he was a young man before he sort of made his own way in the world. And so he talked about much preferring to work with Black people. He drove often and making deliveries with, a man who did the driving since my dad was underage, and my dad would sort of take the beer, out of the truck and deliver it. And so, I guess through my dad, I got one perspective, which was that, Black people in Homestead were the best of what Homestead had to offer, because that was his perception. But I think every family had different experiences. And while there certainly were some of those extraordinary moments, I think some of the same things that we see elsewhere played out there. And I don't want to complain that I don't want to suggest that it was any better. And I'm sure that there are Black families out there with uncomfortable memories that sort of are part of this patchwork of experiences.
Yeah, I imagine so. Thank you. And there's also a number of questions about the synagogue. I guess you could begin with sort of. I believe you said it was an Orthodox synagogue. There's one question asking whether or not it was what denomination it was. But there's other questions about does it still exist, and sort of what was the makeup of the clergy, and sort of its orthodoxy through the years. If you want to say more about that.
So the congregation was founded to be Orthodox in perpetuity, um, and it remained Orthodox in perpetuity. They had an opportunity in the late 50s to merge with a conservative congregation that formed in Pleasant Hills, a community a bit further out from Homestead, where a lot of young families were settling, a lot of transplants from New York, where the husbands were going to work at Bettis Atomic. And so they had an opportunity to merge so they could take the sort of pre-existing institutions of the Homestead Hebrew congregation, matched with the vitality of this new community. But some of the older members of the Homestead congregation absolutely did not want to merge with a non-Orthodox congregation. So the congregation remained on paper Orthodox until the end and missed this opportunity for, I guess, a second lease on life. That said, there was a certain kind of orthodoxy which characterized Jewish American life in that period, which is different from our current period. I've heard it referred to as Orthodox in name only. People who, didn't keep Shabbat, and I didn't really have room for this in the narrative, but from the beginning, it was impossible for the Jewish shopkeepers of Homestead in order to observe the Sabbath. Saturday was at times payday. While they were good about closing their mills in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, you saw that from that little ad on the thank you screen. They did work on Shabbat, so that was already a big no-no. There were some kosher butchers in town for a time, but you certainly see that over time people become more adventurous in their eating and their participation in American culture. And so, for some people, they wanted to belong to a shul that was traditional. Again, a lot of the people who left and went to Beth Shalom were people who wanted something that felt more progressive. But, by the standards of today, where we have an Orthodox community where people are much closer to strict halachic observance, they would look at this community and say this was not Orthodox. And there's some interesting stories that play out in Squirrel Hill during that transitional period, starting in the 40s, where the sort of earlier generation of Orthodox in name only encounters people who were much more strictly Orthodox and who begin to do the work of making the Orthodox congregations in Squirrel Hill truly Orthodox in the way that we know them now. That story doesn't happen in Homestead because the older people who probably cared the most passed on, and the families who stayed were used to doing things the way that they had been done. And, there are all these stories about the women moving around the mechitza as time goes on or trying to get rid of it, and the guy brings it back. But, I do want to emphasize Orthodox, but this very specific, middle of the 20th century kind of Orthodoxy, which doesn't necessarily square with people's perceptions today. I think there were other parts to that question, but I at least got one.
No, yeah, thank you. I think you answered the question there.
Okay.
I see we have only a few minutes left, and there's many questions that are very specific to families' own narratives and stories, and I don't want people to feel like we're ignoring them. I was wondering are you open to maybe receiving emails from people or us passing along questions? We can facilitate that, but I want, in case.
I mean, I do have a website, I think I forgot to self-promote. I have a website. It's at homesteadhebrews.com. And so there's a ton of information on there. You could probably at this point spend months boring yourself to death reading things that I've written over the years. But there's a contact page, and that's how you can reach me. And everyone who knows me knows that I'm very slow on email. But please do reach out and be patient. I'd love to hear from you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we can share that email, that website email and everything, whatever you have there on our follow-up to the program. Because I see so many, people asking questions. There's several questions about a little shoes store and
yeah,
an owner, one of the cousin's father, and
several
people asked about it. So
Little's is a shoe store in the heart of Squirrel Hill. Now I know you're not a Squirrel Hill person. It is connected to Homestead. I read there was an article about that on my website if you want to read more. But yes, the Little's that we know and love on Forbes is connected to Homestead. Hurrah.
Thanks. Yeah, there's so many questions like that out there, but I kind of want to leave, with a few minutes left, I want to leave it to you to sort of say if you have any final thoughts. There's also some questions if you want something to guide you as to what the community looks like today, what the steel mill, sort of what the area of Homestead looks like today in the Jewish community of the area today.
Yes. So the steel mill was torn down and sold for scrap. I think that got cut towards the end of the talk. Okay, so I'm glad I told you that. The steel mill was torn down. And there is now a giant shopping center that takes up all of Lower Homestead. And it's really hard to believe for those of us like me who were not here during the time of steel, just how enormous that steel mill was. It takes a long time, but longer than you would think, to drive from end to end, and to think that entire thing was a steel mill is really quite extraordinary. I'm going to promote another website of mine, which you can link to from that main Homestead Hebrews website. But I did build a map with the help of a friend, Lauren Winkler, which has overlapping layers of Homestead at different periods of time. So you can look at the map as it was before the destruction of the ward, the steel mill, and then the present day shopping center. And so, for example, I looked up my great-grandfather's address and was able to figure out which part of the steel mill was built atop of his former saloon, and to figure out now it is right the edge between the DSW shoe store and Bed Bath & Beyond. So you can do fun things like that, and it can sort of help you visualize what's there. A lot of Squirrel people will know Homestead because it's the Homestead works at, sorry, the Homestead Shopping Center, the waterfront, I should say, because it's a shopping center that really was built for people like us, which maybe gets to the point about what Homestead is today, which is a community that is still struggling with the effects of the steel mill closing. People who could afford to leave left, and so a lot of the housing was turned into Section 8 housing, and the people who moved in were people who had their own problems on top of what had already sort of set in place in Homestead. You do see efforts of gentrification along 8th Avenue. You know, there's a wine bar and a yoga studio and a juice bar, and some of the old buildings like the Masonic Lodge and the Industrial School and the Catholic High School are all being turned into apartments. I mean, all the kinds of things that you would expect, but sort of paradoxically, as you go up the hill, the houses are not in great repair, which is to say that gentrification hasn't reached there yet. I don't say that with like an expectation or an excitement around that. Just, you know, here's the status of things at this moment, and I am not a real estate investor or a merchant, so you know, people are going to do what they're going to do, and I only hope that Homestead can figure it all out in a fairer way than it has in past generations for the people who live there. But you know, for those of us in Pittsburgh, it's just a bridge away, and I know, you know, we're not supposed to like to cross bridges, but it's really quite an easy distance, and you can drive around, and you know, you can drive by the old synagogue, which is, it's now a church, as I alluded to. If you go on a Sunday, you can probably peek in. I used to go to services on Sundays in the beginning, but then I think people misunderstood that as an opportunity to try to convert me. So I felt like that was a little weird. So I tend to hang out more outside these days. But it's nice that that building is in such great shape, because certainly in other steel mill towns, their shuls fell in tremendous disrepair, and now there isn't even a site of pilgrimage, as it were, because those buildings just didn't make it.
Just sort of as a final question of interest for myself, are there still images on the building itself that you can tell that it was once the synagogue? Have they removed them? Yeah.
It changes over time. I feel like the church like changes its branding. So at the moment, there are sort of 10 Commandments plaques sort of in the top center that are original. You can see that there are these two, sorry, church, slightly cheap looking panels with crosses on them. If you compare that to an old photograph of the synagogue on my website, you can see that behind them, I think, were Lions of Judah. The stained glass is still the stained glass. I think they had people try to restore the Hebrew that was on the stained glass, but clearly people who aren't familiar with Hebrew letters, because it's almost impossible to read, because they made little mistakes that they probably thought were ornamentation, but we know is the difference between like a dalet and a resh, let's say, or a resh and a vav. So it's difficult to read, but it's still there. And the cornerstone includes the Hebrew year. So I don't know whether people going by know what they're looking at. But anybody sees that cornerstone, like that is the giveaway more than anything else.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for this talk. It was so fascinating to hear the unique narrative of this community over time, and I appreciate everything you've had to share with us, and I'm sure our audience out there has also learned a great deal. So thank you. And
thank you for having me. This is really great. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good rest of your day.